Coming to Hudson Institute. Thank you for attending, and I want to thank our C-SPAN audience. The panel that we're conducting today, first of all, Representative Mike Pompeo, will not be able to make it this afternoon as we had announced yesterday on the spur of the moment. He very much wanted to be here. They're going to be voting today. He thought he'd be able to get out earlier, but they're going to be voting today, including on Iran issues. And as many of you may know, Representative Pompeo, along with Representative Roxham and Senator Tom Cotton, whom we had a few weeks ago here now, these are the lead advocates for congressional review on the secret side deals between Iran and the IAEA. So even though Representative Pompeo cannot be here, I hope you will follow what he's doing, what Representative Roxham and Senator Cotton are doing. And I believe that this afternoon's panel, we have a fantastic panel led by David Albright, who's been to Hudson before, the president of the Institute for Science and International Security. Mr. Albright has been the analysis that his organization, ISIS, has been providing on the Iran deal, as well as different things about the Iranian nuclear facilities, are invaluable. And I also recommend that you follow what ISIS Nuclear is doing. So thank you very much again, David, for being with us here again. To his left is Omri Ceren, and Omri is the managing director of press and strategy for the Israel Project. And I also need to highly recommend Omri's work, which has Omri has been taking up a lot of the political and policy matters regarding both the Iran deal and the Iran debate unfolding here in Washington. And it's a real privilege to have Omri here. This is his first time at Hudson, I believe, and thanks very much, Omri, for being here.
Thank you.
To his left is my Hudson colleague, a Hudson Institute senior fellow, Michael Doran. And it's always a pleasure to sit on the same panel with Mike. And Mike will be taking up today, he'll be taking up some of the broader implications of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, especially how it relates to American strategy in the Middle East and what it looks like in the what that deal and what the ramifications and consequences of that deal look like in the broader Middle East. So it's really an exceptional panel. I look forward to learning a lot from it, and I hope you do too. And right now, David, if you would start, that'd be terrific.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And must confess, this is my first day back in Washington officially since the end of May. So I've missed much of the personal combat that's been going on this agreement. I must say, my institute and I are neutral on this deal. We were deeply involved in developing provisions in the deal, red teaming provisions. I mean, we work closely with some negotiators in the agreement. Some of the negotiators have said some of the provisions, or we share it. Our name is on it. We share it with other governments or groups, but our name is on several of these provisions. And so, but at the same time, when we've assessed the Lausanne deal and also the final deal, we see several weaknesses in the deal. And I think we decided that in order to do objective, nonpartisan analysis, that we would not take sides in this debate. And so even though I was in Europe, I have done nothing else but assess this deal for the last 2 months, and we've put out probably 10 to 15 reports on provisions of the deal, which I would recommend if you're interested. It is very complicated. It has many strengths. It has many weaknesses. One of the issue today is over the adequacy of the IA Iran Parchin deal to try to solve the problem of access and to contribute to solving the problems associated with determining the verification of the allegations that Iran had a nuclear weapons program in the past. And then to do that in the context that it's the implementation period of the agreement that's going to happen over the fall and winter. And is that verification effort by the IA going to go well? Is it going to strengthen the verification of the final deal, or is it going to create precedents and weaken the verification? And what I'd like to do is just quickly actually summarize a report we'll either issue today or on Monday on this Parchin agreement, and also some general issues around Parchin and satellite imagery analysis of the site. I think it's very clear that the IAEA has reported regularly that the modifications at the Parchin site have undermined their ability to do effective verification. I mean, that's the starting point, is that large amounts of modifications, the IAEA doesn't know what's taken place, but that their analysis from satellite imagery is that it's problematic for verification. Now, I would argue, and I will, that this Iran IAEA Parchin deal has further complicated the verification of that site. It's not a public agreement. We worked intensively on Iran since 2002, and I've worked on many countries: Iraq, South Africa. Worked with the IAEA inspectors in Iraq in the 90s. We've also published extensively about other countries and used IAEA data. The IAEA is a very secretive organization. Its mandate requires secrecy, but in the Iran case, it has not been secret. It's been pretty transparent. Iran has complained about that bitterly for years. It's saying the IAEA is leaking confidential information. I think that the IAEA could make this Iran IAEA deal public, particularly could release it to the member states, and it would actually that would be consistent with what they've been doing on Iran. So I think the secrecy of it raises questions that do need to be addressed, and also in my experience with the IAEA, that they do excessively classify, if I can use a U.S. term, that they'll do it for all the same reasons. It may not have nothing to do with the legitimate ones: proprietary information, security information. It can hide embarrassing information. I would argue that in this case, it's a little bit embarrassing what this Parchin deal has. And I think you've all probably had a chance to see the details of it. The Associated Press went to pretty great lengths to try to get a draft of it. They confirmed that was a draft. They then confirmed, at least they told me, I think they've reported that the final deal isn't that different from the draft. And what you have is the situation where there'll be videotaping of the potential locations where sampling would take place. Then the IAEA would direct the Iranians to take the samples. And that's not the normal way to do things. If I could give the example in Iran of Kalai Electric, a secret centrifuge research and development facility that Iran denied was such a thing. The IAEA got access, and what it brought in a very top-level centrifuge expert with that access who looked around. And when they did the sampling finally, they didn't find any trace of enriched uranium in the areas that had been heavily modified. But in a secondary building, they found in a ventilation duct, which had not been modified, they found traces of enriched uranium. And what it is you need the eyes and the brain to look where to sample. And I brought an example of sampling in North Korea. I can't show it. I mean, this is actually a document, maybe afterward, where they sampled in the Yongbyon reprocessing plant in the early 90s in North Korea. And there North Korea didn't expect environmental sampling. It was a highly classified method that was unclassified as a result of the Iraq War in '91 and the idea to strengthen the IAEA. So they deployed it, and you can see in the sampling they're looking, behind this box. Look, in this case again, North Korea didn't expect it. Look for where it's dusty. And the idea it's not been disturbed. In the case of Parchin, it would be look for where the paint doesn't look solid. And so that's very hard to do with a video camera. So I think the video camera opens up additional methods of deceiving the IAEA, and it's not the normal way they've been doing it. And so I think that's a problem. The other is really precedence, where the IAEA isn't getting access to the physical locations where samples are being taken. And the deal, as reported by AP, says that Amano, the Director General, and his Deputy Director General on safeguards can go as a courtesy visit. Now, in my own work with the AP, and I talked to the journalist involved in this, he believes that the deal he was shown and he was able to transcribe, I mean, it has some errors in it, but they're at the margins, and that he has reported that that is an accurate rendition. In congressional testimony, I know that U.S. officials have testified, and I've heard from, won't say who, sometimes it's congressmen have said that the sampling would be done and then the IA access would follow. And so the access is coming at a point where it's not as useful. Politically, access is important, but again, you want it to drive the inspection effort and the environmental sampling effort, not be done at the end of the process. And so, again, what happens with other sites? What happens if there's another question at Parchin? There's other sites the IA is asked to visit associated with this, the verification of the possible military dimensions of Iran's program. And are they going to be, in a sense, subject to these kind of rules when they go there? Another reason you want access is to talk to the scientists and engineers involved. Now, whether that's going to happen, I don't know. I mean, there's a second secret dealer, and in IA terminology, these are called confidential arrangements. I mean, some people object to the word secrecy, but to me, it's all the same. I mean, but technically, it's a confidential agreement. And but will the IA be able to do its job, which is to come to closure on its verification of Iran's past military activities by December 15th? And I think this agreement on Parchin is weakening that effort. Now, in the broader scheme, with the long-term agreement, you have to ask whether this is setting up precedents for that. I think legally, with the additional protocol, you could argue that it's not. But Iran has violated safeguards agreements many times. It's pushed the envelope. And so let's say you go out and there's a suspect site. The IA has to go there. The clock starts ticking on this access provision of 24 days. Iran says, no, you can't have access, but we can do the video monitoring and we'll take the samples. And what's going to happen? And I would argue and worry, actually, that there's some countries in Europe who are going to be having heavy investments in Iran. And Iran is going to be appealing to them to say, look, this worked in the Parchin case. You accepted it. You supported it publicly. Why can't it work here? Do you really want to snap back inspection or snap back sanctions over something that's proven or was as acceptable in a highly controversial case like Parchin? And I would worry that the Europeans may not stick with the United States. I think the U.S. will vote to snap back. But I think there's worry the United States, the others may not. Certainly, you can't count on Russia and China. So you just need one of the three to say, maybe we're not going to go with this. So I think it's also in the long term, it's a problem. And then finally, we want the IA to be as strong as it can be. I mean, it can be incredibly strong. In North Korea, they nailed the North Koreans to the wall with environmental sampling and other evidence to say they had an undeclared production of plutonium and separation of plutonium. They didn't know how much, but they had them cold. There have been other cases where they've done that. They caught them at Kalai Electric, despite modification. But Iran's gotten better at modification. It's certainly learned. And I think that we can't, I think the Kalai Electric example actually proves the case that you have to worry more about Parchin. It doesn't prove the case that the IA will find it no matter what. That the Iranians have learned and that they are probably much better at modification and undermining the IA than before. And so you want to make sure that the IA goes into this long-term agreement as strong as possible. It does address or satisfy the concerns over the possible military dimensions of Iran's program, and we get closure on that, and that we, in a sense, march into this agreement where the IA has as much credibility as possible. I worry that the way it's going is they're going to have reduced credibility, and that's going to give an advantage to Iran that's going to come back to haunt us.
David, thank you very much. That was a terrific introduction. And I mean, one of the questions I definitely want to come back to is regarding the IAEA's credibility and how this is how this might be affected by that. But one thing I just wanted to check before we went on to Omri, when you were saying that the draft that the AP published, they checked that with, you were saying the IAEA verified that that was close to that, or
I don't know. They went to member states. I mean, this is how this works. I mean, the IA people. Well, let me not put words in AP. They have sources. They're based in Vienna, and that they went to sources to verify.
Okay.
And one can imagine too that well, let me just end it there. I don't want to take any more time.
Okay. That story was sourced to officials from member states specifically. The AP story was sourced to officials from member states.
I just wanted to check that.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you. Omri, if you would like to, if you would like to pick up and fill out some of the,
Sure. I think in addition to the policy environment and especially the geopolitical environment and the verification regime, it's important to understand the dynamics that have emerged here in town over the last month, 2 months. Certainly, I mean, before that, this debate has been shaping up for several years. But really, after the announcement of the JCPOA in the middle of July, you saw a particular kind of debate shape up here in town. And it has a range of dimensions that have to do with intersections between policy and politics, frustration on the Hill. But one of the overarching dynamics, and this really does begin to bite when we talk about the side deals, is the administration is operating, at least in as much as they operate on the Hill, in an environment in which they've lost the benefit of the doubt with many lawmakers, both Republican lawmakers and Democratic lawmakers. And that comes from a number of places. It comes from frustration by lawmakers who believe that they were essentially had their chains pulled for several years. For several years, of course, administration officials would go to the Hill and they would testify that if only were they to be given breathing room for negotiations, they would bring home a deal that robustly resolved the past possible military dimensions of Iran's program, that would lead to the shuttering of Fordo, that would lead to the dismantlement of centrifuges, that would lead very, very pointedly to anytime, anywhere inspections. And members feel betrayed. They're saying openly that had they known back then that this would be the deal now, they would have pursued alternative legislative paths, including most prominently sanctions legislation. So that's one place in which one reason that the administration has lost the benefit of the doubt. Another reason is what members perceive to be simple dishonesty. They believe that the administration has repeatedly politicized intelligence as far as Iranian cheating over the course of the JPOA, the Interim Joint Plan of Action. They believe that the administration is looking the other way on Iranian sanctions busting of UN sanctions. They believe that they're not getting the information, that both the United Nations panel, which was supposed to monitor compliance, and various members of Congress are not getting the information that they deserve. And of course, this has recently come to a head in just the last couple of days in the policy conversation when it comes to the politicization of intelligence that has to do with ISIS. But that's also another thing that's in the air, which is to say they just don't trust the administration to give them accurate information. And then, of course, the third reason why they're operating in an environment of distrust is this specific debate over failing to transmit to lawmakers the side deals, the secret side deals between the IAEA and Iran. And again, secret side deals is a loaded term. It's a term that's used by detractors and opponents of the deal, but there was a moment, it would have been 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, there was a State Department briefing at which an AP reporter finally got frustrated with the administration and said, can we stipulate that a deal that's classified we can call secret and a deal that's parallel we can call side, right? And that kind of ended the debate about whether they're secret side deals, but the other side prefers not to call them secret side deals and in fact uses lines like, it's not secret, this is just the way that adults do business. Now, saying that to a lawmaker when they say that there's a secret side deal is also not a productive way to rebuild trust. That has occurred on a number of occasions, but this specific issue, takes place in a much broader environment, and I don't choose your metaphor, underlines, highlights, puts an exclamation point at the end of deep, deep, deep distrust on the Hill toward the administration, which is one of the reasons why it has legs, why this idea of the secret side deals has legs. That's the political reason. the kind of public affairs reason, or what we would call the communications reason. You know, if you quickly divide the town, politics, policy, public affairs. Politics is distrust on the Hill. The public affairs reason has to do with how the administration approached messaging on this issue. So the administration does polling. Both sides on this debate do a ton of polling. And both sides, very, very early, saw the same three things popping up. One was the importance of science and expertise, which is why the administration never missed an opportunity, especially during the last few months of the negotiations, to emphasize that scientists agree with them. This kind of reached a point that caused a lot of people to smirk. Secretary of Energy Moniz, during the Vienna talks, went to, I want Portugal or Spain, somewhere in Iberia, for an award. And he came back, and then he tweet-picked a picture, and it's now back to work to lock in an agreement based on hard science. Right? Just anywhere that they could insert the term, they inserted it because they saw that it boosted public popularity. The second thing that both sides saw was how you describe the agreement really matters. The administration discovered very early that if you describe the agreement as Iran agrees never to construct a nuclear weapon, they saw the same thing we saw, which is an 8 to 10 point bump in approval. They then, by the way, took that wording and started inserting it into their own polls or into the polls of validators in order to boost the numbers. That was the second thing. But the third thing that both sides saw was that voters overwhelmingly dislike Iran. Iran has the lowest favorability of most Middle East actors, highest unfavorability. But the reason they do it, the reason that what causes that dislike is distrust. So you ask people, why should the U.S. stand in opposition to Iran? It's a standard kind of wording that we use, and they cite all sorts of things. Iran is dedicated to the destruction of the U.S., destruction of our allies. Iran stones rape victims for adultery. Iran hangs gays from cranes. But what's underneath that is distrust. They don't trust Iran not to do those things, which is why you saw the administration develop the talking point that this deal is not built on trust. And if you go back to their materials, that develops very, very, very early because they were seeing the same things we were seeing, which is distrust is potentially toxic to support of negotiations with Iran. The side deals agreement, in the same way that in a political dimension, reinforces pre-existing distrust among lawmakers, in a public affairs dimension, reinforces public distrust. The reason that this is so toxic in terms of the White House's public affairs campaign is because it very, very, very precisely casts a spotlight on something that they very much do not want to play with, which is distrust of Iran. And now there's the policy implications. David talked a lot about this in a greater depth, but one thing that I think it's important to note is that it's not just the policy community that's concerned about the Parchin arrangement becoming a precedent. The arrangement, of course, is videotaping, allowing the Iranians to take their own samples and then hand them over to the agency, and negotiating with the Iranians on a limited number of samples that will be taken from a limited number of places. Congressman Royce sent a letter to Secretary Kerry in which he also discussed his worry that this would become a precedent. And he cited specifically one of the paragraphs in Annex 1 of the JCPOA, somewhere in the 70s, forgive me, I should know this actually, but 71 or 77, that talks about alternative arrangements that the Iranians are allowed to offer when the agency requests access. And Representative Royce told Secretary Kerry, I worry that this will become a precedent. So you have this side deals issue playing out really across everything that counts in town here, politics, policy, and public affairs. And in the last 48 hours, that has now become a legislative issue, or at least an issue in the battle between Congress and the President over the arrangements. So there's been a lot of talk on the Hill, both among Democrats and Republicans, but in the context of this strategy, it's largely a Republican strategy, that the so-called Corker clock, the 60-day clock during which Congress has the right to review the JCPOA and, if they feel so moved, to pass a resolution of disapproval, that clock hasn't started. The administration and, frankly, leadership in the Senate have stated that it started when the administration transmitted a number of documents relevant to their disclosure obligations. Some of those have been leaked, some of those haven't. Those involve things like the U.S.'s collapse on PMDs, involves arrangements, involves why the intelligence community believes that that collapse is justified. So we know the content of a number of these documents. They were transmitted immediately. They were transmitted within a couple days of getting back from Vienna. The clock, according to this reading, ends on September 17th, which is the last day Congress would have to pass a resolution of disapproval. There are many people who are now claiming that because of the non-transmission of the IAEA side deals, that clock hasn't started. There was, until the last 48 hours, no real recourse for those people. They could complain, they could say it was illegal. There wasn't much they could do. On Tuesday, D.C. District Court ruled for the first time ever, this was in the context of an Obamacare case, that injury that's done to Congress's Article I prerogatives is in fact something that can be litigated. In more technical terms, they granted standing to the House to pursue claims of injury against the president. That created the possibility, this has now been discussed by several legal scholars, but it's being written about broadly, but the main one is a Washington Post legal blogger, Eugene Kontranovich. And he has taken this, he's now written 2 articles that says that in fact, the injury done to Congress's Article I prerogatives does constitute something that can be litigated. He published his first analysis of this yesterday, just afternoon, at roughly the same time, and I mean within 15 minutes. Politico posted an article with a statement from Speaker Boehner saying that based on the new ruling, i.e. the finding that Congress has standing to pursue litigation, he may well sue President Obama, or the House may well sue President Obama, over the non-transmission of documents. Now, the reasoning is actually a little bit subtle. The reasoning is that the Corker clock never started, which means Congress never had the ability to weigh in at all. So it's not your usual claim that it's illegal to waive sanctions. But if that occurs, then it would obviously change the policy it would radically change the policy environment. For instance, one of the things that the Iranians are counting on is a stable regulatory environment that would encourage companies to enter. It's difficult to see how companies could enter in a political environment in which there's bipartisan opposition in both chambers of Congress to the deal and a legal environment that is uncertain. And I think on that point we'll
Omri, thanks. That's fantastic. Just very quickly, do you know, I mean, if Speaker of the House Boehner, if he'd been moving on that before the Post piece? Is this something that they were talking about before?
So there were definitely discussions at the beginning of the week and beforehand about a possible litigation strategy, but they usually ended with the idea that Congress would not be able to find a way to have standing, and it would just get bounced out of court. Now, if you read the Politico article, it specifically cites the reasoning behind this new district court finding. But
so were they all waiting for this decision to come down? Are they saying this might, or is this a surprise?
I think they've been looking for ways to enforce what they consider to be their prerogatives. Because remember, one of the weird things about this, about the kind of the politics around the Corker-Cardin debate and the side deals specifically that we're discussing today, is not meeting the Corker-Cardin requirements, which is to say not turning over all of the documents that are relevant to the deal, is disobeying Congress's prerogatives on a piece of legislation about Congress's prerogatives. Right? It's not just not enforcing legislation. It's not enforcing legislation that's specifically about enforcing legislation, and that was passed by enormous majorities, 98-1 in the Senate, signed by the president, veto-proof majorities. And so I think there were discussions about how to enforce Congress's prerogatives that were ongoing. Certainly there were discussions on Wednesday before the Washington Post piece came out, but the Washington Post piece provided a rationale, or at least outlined a rationale that had not existed without being grandiose about this in the history of the Republic. Right. This is a new thing.
Very interesting. Thanks, Omri. That was terrific. Mike, if you can round us off and give us the even larger picture that we already have here.
Sure. Omri just said it's the first time in the history of the Republic, but it reminds me that de Tocqueville said in the 19th century that any issue of significance in American politics eventually finds its way into the courts. And that's the kind of prediction that political analysis that I would like to to produce something that remains true forever. The interesting thing,
I
love
hope someone has tweeted that.
I love David Albright's analysis. I said to him beforehand, before we came in, that there's sort of two kinds of personalities in the world: the hedgehogs and foxes, I think. And he's a fox. He sees complexity. He likes to talk about complexity, and I like to lump things together and make them very simple. So I'm going to simplify what he said and turn it into a crudely political statement and say that the administration caved on in serious inspections with regard to the possible military dimensions of the Iranian program. The question is, why did they cave, and what does it mean? What do these secret side deals mean, or how come adults are doing business in this manner? And for me, this whole question of the secret side deals epitomizes the entire approach to the nuclear question. Or you can see embedded in this or reflected in this the motives and the approach of the administration to the whole thing. And that's a general statement. Let me give you the specifics. One of the fascinating, or a lot of people are saying about the administration when they see things like this, when they've caved on what we might call the more coercive measures of the agreement. So the inspections and verification and snapback and so on. When you look closely at these mechanisms, they evaporate. Our colleagues here at Hudson, Hillel Fradkin and Scooter Libby, did a very good analysis of the so-called 23 days that the Iranians have in order to oppose any effort to inspect a suspect site. And under their analysis, which I think is very convincing, the 23 days quickly becomes many months. Possibly even longer, because of the inability to bring this process to an end at any point and to actually coerce the Iranians into getting what you want. And as David sort of suggested, at a certain point you find yourself, when you're pushing up against the Iranians, the only option you have is the, for lack of a better word, the nuclear option of blowing up the whole deal in order to get what you want from them. So it isn't really a very effective mechanism. Now, when people look at this, at the way that the administration has caved on these coercive measures, there's a tendency to say that we were bamboozled, that the Iranians are master negotiators, they play chess, we play checkers, we're just, small-town American simpletons, and they live in this complex Middle Eastern environment, and so on. But actually, the people running our government are more clever than that. They're not small-town simpletons, and they know what they're doing. They are presenting what is actually one kind of agreement as another kind of agreement. Because as Omri has told us, they've done, and as I'm sure he's correct, they've done extensive polling of the American people, and they found out that the American people don't trust the Iranians, and they don't want a U.S. strategy that is based on trusting the Iranians. But the fact of the matter is, the president decided almost from the moment he got into office, possibly even before he got into office, that we need the Iranians as a partner in the Middle East. And the logic is absolutely simple. The most important decision that the president made about the Middle East, about Iran, was one he made when he was campaigning, and that is that he was going to pull the United States back from the region. The minute you say you want to pull the United States back from the region, then you are done. You are done as the leader of a serious policy designed to contain Iran in the region. The only way then to affect that pullback is to come to some kind of accommodation with the Iranians. And the biggest problem you have in terms of coming to an accommodation with the Iranians is their nuclear program. So they needed a way to put the nuclear question off to one side while they got down to the serious business of aligning with the Iranians against ISIS and other. That's the bad ISIS, not the good ISIS that David runs, against ISIS and other actors. And so that's what this agreement, in my view, is really all about. Yes, they do want to stop the nuclear program. That is a goal of the Obama administration, but it is not the only goal they have, and it's not the primary goal. The primary goal is to pull the United States back from the Middle East and to come up with a regional security architecture that will allow the United States to stay out. And so these two goals have been working simultaneously all along, and at a certain point they run counter to each other. Because in order to pull the U.S. back, they've got to reach an agreement on the nuclear program, and that's the Iranians picked up on that, and they recognized that getting the agreement was more important for the administration than anything else, and they realized that they could use it to their advantage, and they could come up with the Iranians could offer solutions that were not really solutions that the administration would accept in the end. So you get this. I mean, to see the amount of creative intelligence that has gone into this on the part of the administration in order to present to us something that is really something else is startling. And the side deals is a great example. First of all, you subcontract out some of the work to the IAEA so that you can say, well, nothing to do with me. I haven't seen those agreements, don't even know what's in them. It isn't part of some kind of secret arrangement that I have with the Iranians. The other thing that they've done, which you can see if you read closely in the text of the agreement, is that they have sequenced the issues so that it looks like we're getting something that we're not actually getting. The sequencing in time is that the Iranians have to answer the IAEA's questions about the possible military dimensions of their program, and the IAEA will submit a report by December 15th, and it's only after that, the submitting of that report, that we get implementation day for the agreement. That's the point at which the sanctions are removed from the Iranians. That sequencing allows the administration to stand and say with a complete sincerity, complete straight face, and total honesty that the lifting of the sanctions will not take place until after the Iranians submit their answers to the IAEA. Totally true. What it doesn't tell you, though, is that it makes it sound like there's a conditionality applied here. That the Iranians have to answer questions that actually satisfy us about their and actually satisfy the IAEA in some significant way, that we now know about the possible military dimensions of their program. But that's not what's going to happen. The Iranians are going to submit answers. The IAEA is going to submit a report, and then the sanctions are going to be removed, regardless of what the Iranians say, and regardless of what the IAEA puts in its report. Now, both actors, the Iranians and the IAEA, recognize that that they will be putting the United States and the entire P5+1, all of those European foreign ministers who have already been to Tehran with trade delegations and so on, will be completely discomfited if the IAEA says, you know what, the Iranians stiffed us again. So the Iranians will do their best to come as far toward the IAEA as they can without actually delivering anything that the IAEA really wants. And Amano will be under enormous political pressure to produce a report that will not embarrass the Americans and the other P5+1 partners. But even if he does, implementation day still goes forward. Because as the agreement is written, there is absolutely no conditionality. And that, to me, that is what I say when I see it's reflective of the whole agreement. The President of the United States wants an agreement with Iran, and he wants an agreement with Iran for reasons that have to do with nuclear questions, but even more so for reasons that have to do with the whole position of the United States in the Middle East. And you can see this unfolding before your eyes right now with the Russians and the Iranians coordinating in an increase in their support for the Assad, their direct military support for the Assad regime. This is the direct outcome of the strategic concept of the Americans of working together with the Russians and the Iranians to try to tamp down the worst pathologies of the Middle East. And at some point, we should start debating that concept. The administration has not come clean. that that is the strategic concept that is working. The president has not come clean. When asked if he thinks that this agreement is going to lead to a greater flexibility of the Iranians in the region, he says, the administration talks out of both sides of their mouth. They will say, well, we're hoping that that might happen, but that's not why. We're not trusting them. That's not why we're making the agreement. We think the agreement stands alone by itself. It is why they're doing it. They are doing it because it is part of this larger concept, and the larger concept is flawed. I'd love, Lee, if later on we could talk about why it's flawed, but it's flawed, and in the end, it won't work.
No, this is great. I do want to come back to that. But right now, David had a, and I was going to ask him to comment, even if he didn't volunteer a comment on what you were saying about the IAEA. So, David, if you...
Yeah, I think my organization, we're split. I mean, some think what Michael's saying is this is all a cynical exercise. And the argument is, look, Iran has modified Parchin. The IAEA is very unlikely to find anything. I mean, what are we talking about in the end? I mean, I don't want to get too technical, but it's, a test of a neutron initiator made out of uranium and deuteride. It may have 3 grams, 4 grams of uranium in it that was then blown up, 13 years ago or more. And Iran's had 3 years to eliminate any traces of that. And you see it all over the area that they've done cleanup. They know where it went. They know the weather patterns that day. They know what they need to do. And they've had experience at cleanup in other sites. So they can... So the cynical version is they're not going to find anything, so who cares if this is a weak deal? Just get through this. Get Omano to plant the IAEA flag at Parchin and say we've gotten access. Another side of my group wants that, well, look, at every step of this process, we want the IAEA to be doing the most rigorous verification possible. We want to make sure their credibility is strong. We want to make sure that if they go to Parchin and they say we didn't find any uranium, that they can say it's because of modification, and we believe that's true. And or maybe they'll find uranium. I mean, maybe they'll get lucky, and they'll find uranium. But then you've got to attribute or assign, or what's the term? Show that uranium was related to an experiment related to nuclear weapons, and that's another problem I didn't get into. But that attribution is non-trivial. There's a lot of uranium in the world, and so you've got to detect it and attribute it properly. So you want them to be doing the most rigorous methods possible in order to gain credibility in their findings. And the other, and then what Michael's saying is, well, this is a box-checking exercise. The administration said you're not going to find. We know they had a nuclear weapons program. We don't really care about the past. We care about the future, and that let's just get through this, and get the sanctions off. I know I've been briefed by White House officials who've said they do care, and I also realized we're a very technical organization, and we've dealt with technical people in various countries on this. We don't deal with the policy and the PR parts. And I know that by February, March, April of this year, that what I was being told in briefings by White House officials was different than what NGOs were being told by more senior White House officials. And I even complained about it, and the answer I got was, you just have to understand it's different. It's different. And but
I'm sorry. Can you say how it was different?
Well, I don't want to go into any examples per se, but it's over. This would be an example. Well, let me use this. This would be an example where I'm told it does matter. If the IAEA's concerns are not addressed, and we can talk about what that means, may not mean what you're thinking, that sanctions would not come off. But listen to Secretary of State Kerry. Others are so told, and you hear him say, what happened in the past doesn't matter. Is that my phone?
Yep.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I turned it off. So I think
that's not Secretary Kerry.
Yeah. But the bottom line, that's right. But the bottom line is that we don't know. And in fact, when I commented on this difference in the briefings, my reaction was, look, the people who are briefing these NGOs, and I think they're really spinning them. I mean, I'm kind of disturbed by how the arms control community has bought into a lot of stuff to win this fight that is compromising I believe, their integrity. But the bottom line is that the people who are higher are spinning where the technical scientific people are lower, and I believe they're not. But who's going to control the decision on implementation day?
Well,
and that's really the issue, is that there's no meeting scheduled among the P5+1 to sit down and say, they've addressed the IAEA concerns. It'll be up to what happens in the U.S. government mind on implementation day to make a decision whether this condition would stop the lifting of sanctions.
I'm ready to predict right now what's going to happen in implementation.
I'm not. And let me just add, we approach this very differently. You use an example of Fox or, whatever. What was it?
Hedgehog or Fox.
We see it very differently. We see that scientists in Washington are constantly confronted with the reality of, if you're going to make a mistake, do it right. And that what happens is that we see our role as we see problems, and that we also want an integrity to the process. We do want it more transparent, of course, but we want an integrity to the process, that the work is done rigorously and that it can withstand review. And so I think that motivates our work to a great extent. And that's also why we're neutral, because we want to be able to look at the strengths and value those, and we want to look at the weaknesses and just get into it without thinking or hearing a voice in our ear, oh my God, you support the deal, you better not say that. And I can tell you we get beat up all the time because, left-wing groups use our work, or I guess right now in this debate, we've had these fights before on the aluminum tubes in Iraq. August, September 2002, our work questioning the aluminum tubes use in centrifuges was certainly not appreciated by the right wing. And we took a lot of abuse for those positions. On the Syrian reactor, we thought the site bombed by Israel was a reactor, and many in the left attacked us and went after us for that. And we see this case today on the Iran deal, particularly this summer, where the left, I think, is attacking us, and it's in the similar vein, where they're defending things that really shouldn't be defended. This deal has problems that have to be faced, and I think the IAEA is one of them, that you need to find a way, and this is where maybe I am not as pessimistic as you, and maybe it's just optimistic. The IAEA has to find a way to strengthen what it's doing over the next several months. You're not going to change this IAEA Parchin deal or IAEA Iran Parchin deal. It's in place, but they can try to make the best of it. They can then try to get access to other sites. They can do a rigorous job on the verification of the possible military dimensions issue, and try to come out of this with the strongest report possible in December, and that they can withstand criticism.
Omri, I think you wanted to follow up. Mike.
This issue of what the White House was telling, most of the think tanks in the city have attempted to work with the administration in order to point out flaws over the previous 2 years and so on, fix them. That's happened both on the nuclear side, the stuff that David works on, but also in the context of the sanctions regime and so on. And the dynamic really did develop where the White House would be telling its validators, these NGOs, one thing, and would be telling these experts that were trying to contribute a different thing. So experts would show up with concerns like PMDs, with concerns like, the Iranians will push back against inspections, with concerns like, what are you doing allowing the Iranians to produce heavy water reactors after 15 years out of the Lausanne Agreement? And they would be told, and the experts would be told one thing, and then the NGOs would be spun up and told something different.
I'm sorry, I just want to check, because just to make sure what David was saying, that the experts were being told something by lower level officials who were also themselves scientific or technical experts.
Largely, but not always.
Okay, all right. But the NGO people were being, as David was saying, more senior officials.
And as David was saying,
politically invested
perhaps one of the gentlest things could be say we're being spun up. But then, toward the end, especially the final days of Vienna and especially after Vienna, something very distressing began to happen, which is that all of the excuses that were being provided to the White House validators, to these NGOs, to go out and then validate, were actual concessions that got built into the agreement. And so we do know on which side the actual text falls. So on one side, when it comes to things like PMDs, the possible military dimensions of Iran's past nuclear work, experts were being told, of course these matters, we need them to baseline the program, we don't know how far the Iranians got. There are all kinds of technical details, like it's important to know what kind of bomb design they were working on, because that goes into calculations of how much uranium they need in order to produce that bomb, which is the breakout calculation. So there are all kinds of experts saying, of course we need to resolve these PMDs. And then there was the spin that was, it crystallized in Secretary Kerry's statement to a teleconference to State Department journalists, which is, we have absolute knowledge of Iran's past nuclear work, and we don't need the Iranians to tell us what they did. One was spin, and by the way, he was roundly criticized for that, and the State Department spent the next week walking back that statement. And yet, that is the reading that was transmitted to Congress. We know that among the documents that were submitted to Congress pursuant to its Corker-Cardin obligations, there were 2 documents that dealt with the PMDs issue, at least 2. One of those documents said, we've come to the conclusion that it's unrealistic and unnecessary to force Iran to come clean on its past nuclear work, because the U.S. intelligence community has judged that it has sufficient knowledge to detect an Iranian breakout and to enforce the deal without having the Iranians come clean. And then it said, for an explanation why, please see subsequent classified annex. So that's the first thing that, I believe it was the Wall Street Journal that reported the existence of those 2 documents. Bloomberg View subsequently reported on the contents of that other document, the one that purports to explain why it is that the IC judges that it doesn't need Iran to come clean on its past nuclear work. And it turns out that assessment is premised, without exaggeration, without hyperbole, it's premised on near total Iranian cooperation with inspectors over the lifetime of the deal. Right? In a very precise way, trusts the Iranians. So when we talk about this very, very frustrating process that occurred as the JCPOA was coming together, where experts were being told one thing and White House validators were being told another, one of the distressing things is that by the end, the spin had become the U.S.'s position. That the expert view that we do indeed need Iran to resolve its past to come clean on its past military nature of its nuclear work was abandoned in favor of this spin that we know enough about what happened in the past and all that matters is the future.
Thanks, Omri. Mike, I think you wanted to respond as...
Yeah, I just wanted to say that that the picture that David presented of lower-level technical experts being committed to their job and thinking the best of all this, in contrast to, and not being influenced by political considerations, and higher-level officials having a different view, is built into the DNA of the Obama administration. Of course, it exists in any administration. To a certain extent, but it's really heightened in the case of the Obama administration. And I think everybody now recognizes this. For a while, it was only, I think, critics of the administration who said this, and now I think everyone can see it. There is the president and 4 or 5 close people around him, and then there is everybody else. And the president and his closest advisors are often not sharing with the everybody else some of their greatest concerns and calculations. And we saw it just in the last couple of days. There's a fascinating article in Bloomberg by Josh Rogan about the Russian move, the Russian military move in Syria. And the first reaction of the State Department when this happened was to go to the Russians and the Bulgarians and to protest them giving the Russians the overflight and staging rights for the Russians to supply their forces in Syria. But according to Rogan, the president was very unhappy with this because the State Department had run out and done this without consulting him. So my takeaway from that is that the president has one view about the relative advantages and disadvantages of what the Russians are doing, and the State Department has another. and the president hasn't shared his thinking about the value of the Russian and Iranian actions in Syria with the State Department, and he's not going to do it. He's not going to do it because precisely what Omri explained to us is that the American public does not trust the Iranians, and a U.S. strategy that is based on coordinating with the Iranians is going to be politically illegitimate.
Mike, let me ask you. I mean, you worked in the Bush White House, and we understand that this is it's not an unusual phenomenon. The idea that a White House and State Department don't necessarily see eye to eye. These are different bureaucracies with different ideas. White House is political appointees, and State Department you have it's a permanent bureaucracy. How is this different?
It's different in that the so sorry, just to connect up the dots, so that's how you get to what David was saying before. You get actual technical experts who are presenting what the administration is doing with respect to on the basis of technical considerations and the traditional non-proliferation concerns that the U.S. Government has. When those non-proliferation concerns are not what's actually motivating the government at the top, the difference is this. I talked to a high-level Obama official, and this is about a year ago, and I put to him my thesis that the United States is aligning with Iran. And I pointed to a number of different examples where I saw that happening on the ground in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and so on. And he said, "No, you've got it totally wrong, Mike. The thing about Barack Obama is that he approaches the region like a lawyer. Each problem in the region is a separate file. So there's an Iranian nuclear file, there's an Iraq file, there's a Syria file, there's a Palestinian file, and so on and so forth. And he adamantly refuses, he treats each case on a case-by-case basis, and he adamantly refuses to make a connection between the different cases. All right? And I look at that, that's what it looks like if you're a high-level official in the Obama administration dealing with the president. The New York Times famously described the president in a meeting about Syria where he was thumbing through his BlackBerry, reading distracted while this discussion about whether the United States should arm the opposition was going on or not. My view on that is that the president had, in fact, connected up all of the dots. He just wasn't sharing the connections that he had made with his officials. He was allowing meetings like this one in the NSC about Syria to go on, allowing the bureaucracy to do its thing, to keep everybody busy, because he knew what the single most important thing was what he sent in a letter, according to the Wall Street Journal, to Ali Khamenei. Don't worry, Mr. Supreme Leader, the United States will not do anything on the ground in Syria to harm Bashar al-Assad. Right? This is the guarantee that he gave to Khamenei. And if you look now, for a couple of years, we have been arming and training the Syrian opposition. In the last year, we spent $500 million on arming and training the Syrian opposition, and we produced what? 54 soldiers. 54 soldiers who have actually signed a declaration saying that they won't do anything to harm Assad. Nowhere has President Obama gone out in public and said, I'm not going to do anything to harm Assad because I made this promise to Ali Khamenei, because I don't want to do anything to throw a wrench in the works of the Iran deal, or because I want to coordinate with Iran in the region. He hasn't said that publicly, and he hasn't told that to his officials in the Syria meeting where everything is going around. He let that meeting go round, and then finally when the National Security Council, the major members of the National Security Council said we should arm the opposition, he said, no, I don't want to do it. So he ate up months and months and months of government time debating this issue, and then nixed it, and that's what's happened time and time again. And all that matters in the end is what we do or don't do to stop Iran on the ground in these areas. And as long as he is comfortable knowing that we can make sure that we don't do anything to stop them, he gets what he wants without ever declaring what it is.
David, I was going to ask you a question unless you wanted to say something. Just wanted to change tracks a little bit. does the Parchin deal, does the Parchin side deal, secret side deal, does this hurt the IAEA? I mean, I don't think the administration is necessarily looking to hurt the organization, but do you think it does?
Well, the short answer is I'm worried it does, but I think there needs to be some background. The United States has tremendous influence with the IAEA, but it doesn't pull its strings. And kind of as a background, I don't know if you remember in the press, there was discussion that the negotiators were going to create a list of sites and people that the IAEA would get access to, and that was going to be kind of, the reporting was that it was going to be hardwired into the deal. They went to the IAEA and they said, look, we have our own lists. In essence, kind of pushing back. And I don't think the negotiators really knew what to do. And so I would think that this Iran-IAEA deal was not done with the approval of the United States. Again, this is just my own experience, that I don't think they would have said, go do this. They have been pretty clear in meetings I've had. They want access to Parchin. They don't. Some of them don't think anything will be found.
I'm sorry, I just want to be clear. The U.S. does or the IAEA does?
The U.S. wants access to the IAEA to have access to Parchin. They want the IAEA to have access to other sites that are associated with, if I can use the acronym, the PMD. And the reason is simple, that Iran can't create precedents that sites in Iran are off limits. The safeguards agreements do not distinguish between military and civilian sites. Under the traditional safeguards agreement, the IAEA can go where it needs to go. And there's no such distinction. It can ask to go to a military site. I mean, the IAEA could have called for a special inspection at Parchin. It chose not to do that. The board wouldn't have said, oh, you can't do that because it's a military site. They never would have done that. So the United States has strongly wanted to have the precedent set that Iran can't deny access, but they want a deal, so this gets into a very complicated debate. So how is the U.S. going to react? I mean, I think part of the problem I've seen from Europe is that I think both sides are so distorting the facts. I mean, let me be honest, that it's hard to have an honest debate and an objective debate about this. I mean, we live on the left. I mean, that's where we are. I mean, I'll admit it. My group wants nuclear disarmament. We see Iran and North Korea as the front line of efforts to get nuclear disarmament, not wrestling with U.S. nuclear weapons stockpile size. So we're deeply committed to these causes traditionally associated with the left, and we're deeply disturbed by how the left has bought into positions and says things that aren't even consistent with their own views. Secrecy at the IAEA, that's traditionally a left view. IAEA needs to be more open. Large centrifuge programs, hundreds of thousands of centrifuges in Iran in 15 to 20 years. I mean, most of them are anti-nuclear power, or at least don't buy into large sensitive enrichment programs in dangerous regions of the world, and yet they did and have. So I think there is a need to pull back from this kind of polarization to have a more honest discussion. And in that, I would say that the implementation of this deal does matter, and that the United States and others, the public, should be pushing that the IAEA do a rigorous job. They recover from this Iran-IAEA or this Parchin deal, and that they push hard to get access to bolster their credibility and make sure, with the support of the member states, that they march into this post-implementation day agreement as strong as possible. And then I would say, what do we do? This is a town that works with Congress. I would hope that Congress does create legislation that puts in conditions to make sure that the deal is implemented better. I mean, we've proposed one. I don't know. We don't lobby. We don't follow all the politics of it, and it seems very chaotic right now. That Congress would pass a law that said U.S. sanctions, and again, U.S. sanctions wouldn't be removed unless Iran addresses the IAEA's PMD concerns. That you could have one on another issue. You could have policy of the United States that we don't accept Iran building an unnecessary uneconomical, large, and I emphasize large, they can have some, large centrifuge program after year 5 or after year 13 is when it starts to happen in a dangerous region of the world. It's just our policy to oppose that. Doesn't mean you renegotiate the deal, but you just say, look, we're going to oppose that. What does that mean practically? Well, if a country sells a nuclear power plant to Iran, and China's talking about it now, I'm sure Russia has been, you say, look, all the fuel has to be provided for that reactor for the lifetime of the reactor. You eliminate any motivation for Iran to produce the enriched uranium or even have an argument to produce the enriched uranium for those reactors. It's going to be hard enough to get a program large enough, but you can simply say that a condition of supply is that all the fuel is provided for that reactor. It would not be provided indigenously. If Iran wants reactors, it'll sign that deal. And I could give other examples where you can actually create policies or actions now that can, in a sense, mitigate the weaknesses of this deal.
Omri, did you want to follow up? I mean, among other things, I would sort of like to ask you to, politically speaking, what are the mechanisms that you think have led to? I just want to go through one more round and then open up to a question or two. But what are the political mechanisms or exigencies that have led to this moment where we wound up with this agreement, Parchin, the secret side deal, and how do we avoid it in the future? How do we?
Sure. One of the hallmarks of this debate is that, it's a more specific version of what Mike was talking about, which is this has not been and I suppose a more specific version of what David's talking about, this has not been a clean public debate. This has not been a debate. A lot of this debate has occurred with not just different claims being made, but claims that were either in one way or another not binding. The usual way that, at the risk of oversimplification, the usual way policy proceeds is policymakers lay out their goals, they articulate why they believe that a particular policy has more benefits than costs, and then they defend them. But we've gone through a 2-year process where the administration repeatedly told lawmakers, please back off. If you give us breathing room, we will do things like, of course, the Iranians will be forced to come clean. Undersecretary Sherman, every time she went to the Hill, emphasized that. Of course, inspectors will have to get access to Parchin. State Department, I think then spokeswoman Marie Harf once sarcastically brushed off a reporter who asked about that and said, I think we would find it very hard to accept an agreement where inspectors didn't have access to Parchin. We would shutter Fordo. We would get them to dismantle centrifuges. And then as those commitments began to fall by the wayside, a number of things happened. The main one was this claim that often was done unblinkingly of, well, we never said that in the first place. Of course, this got to the level of absurdity with the Anytime Anywhere inspections where Secretary Kerry said, nobody ever mentioned Anytime Anywhere to me. And people said, Secretary Moniz, who was sitting next to you, mentioned that. That happened in interviews, it happened during testimony. And so we haven't had the usual way that public deliberation proceeds, which is on the basis of, listen, nobody's asking, and it will never be achieved in actually existing democracies. Nobody's asking for absolute facts, absolute honesty. Everybody comes to the table as a computer. But the idea that there's no accountability for past commitments, commitments made to lawmakers, commitments articulated to journalists, commitments developed in public, is a very strange thing, even if you don't assume the Doran thesis that there is actually a grand strategy being pursued that involves, if not full-blown realignment, then at least entente with Iran. Even if you don't accept that, from the outside looking in, it's just a very strange debate. But there is reason to believe that that's being pursued. It's not just the right, it's not just opponents of the deal who have said that what's effectively being negotiated is an entente with Iran. The policy chief, I think he's the policy chief at NIAC, the pro-Iran lobby here in town, wrote an article about a month ago that said that Israel will find itself completely internationally isolated, in as many words, unless it accepts U.S.-Iran entente as foreseen by the deal. And so it's a very, very strange debate. And the answer to your question, and this is the side deals debate in a macrocosm, the answer is there needs to be more transparency. You know, the Corker-Cardin legislation was designed to allow a more robust public debate, having facts in hand about what the deal actually does, which is one of the reasons why this side deals issue and why a little more broadly the PMD issue has legs both politically and in a policy sense and in a public affairs sense. And it's because, you know, just to take these documents that were submitted, Congress asked the president to submit documents outlining what actually is in the deal so they could have this debate in public. The documents that were submitted, we now know, were either, in some cases, fully classified. So again, the PMD's issue, right, which was kind of, people rolled their eyes when this came out. A kind of non-public document that says the administration has concluded we don't need Iran to come clean, and then it says, and for the reason why, see the classified document that's also attached. Right? It made a mockery of that requirement, but we also know more broadly that those documents, and I believe it was the Daily Beast that reported this, the administration appears to have gone out of its way to mix classified with non-classified material into each of the documents they submitted in turn in order to prevent them from being disclosed publicly. And that undercuts the ability to have a debate. And again, why do you overclassify something? You overclassify something accidentally, or you overclassify it because of institutional needs, or you overclassify it because risk rewards indicate you should classify rather than declassify. But a lot of the reasons you classify something is to prevent embarrassment, and that appears to have occurred a lot during this debate.
Mike, would you like to, and then I think I am going to open it up for a question or two, but if you would like to summarize, as it were.
I'll just say that with respect to what Omri just said, I too have been disturbed by the way that the administration has presented things on Monday in a way that it completely contradicted on Tuesday, and then nobody is troubled by it. But I would also add that this has played out, and this has played out from the moment the interim deal was signed in November of 2013. I think that the final agreement that we got was pretty well prefigured in the interim agreement, and the interim agreement gave the Iranians the right to enrich. Of course, that phrase was not in the agreement, but it effectively gave them the right to enrich, and it also gave them the sunset clause that this is going to only be a temporary restriction on the program, and at the same time, while the agreement was being negotiated, we saw greater and greater coordination between the United States and the Iranians on the ground in the Middle East, to the point where we had Shiite militias, armed, trained, equipped, and effectively led by the Iranians on the ground in Iraq, enjoying the air cover of the United States Air Force. So the public has been informed. Right. What's surprising to me is the number of people who have seen this clearly and have pretended not to. I can't completely explain why that is.
I was just going to say, I think that a lot of people have seen it clearly. I think if we saw some of the statements coming out, especially some of the Democratic senators who came out in support of the JCPOA. Senator Booker comes immediately to mind. Senator Coons as well expressed certain reservations. If you look at a lot of people coming out and in favor of the deal, I mean, it's really like esoteric writing. They're describing why the deal is deeply problematic, and nonetheless they say, I'm supporting it. So it seems that some people do actually recognize it, but they recognize it. They recognize the part.
I mean, the way the administration has helped those people emotionally get over their qualms is by its latest talking point, which is that we're going to push back against the Iranians after the deal, and the deal is going to help us do that in the region. And the deal is going to help us do this. Pushback is the new...
Right, it will make military force easier. Now this is a good thing.
Is the new slogan. So on the one hand, we have this picture of a deal that is going to strengthen Iran economically, militarily, and diplomatically, and it's going to do so immediately. And you can see that happening before your eyes, with the trade delegations from Europe going to Tehran, with the Russians and the Iranians coordinating in Syria, with the Russians releasing the S-300 anti-aircraft missiles, and so on and so forth. You can see it all right happening before your eyes. And so the administration is saying, yes, we're strengthening Iran, but we're going to push back. But we're going to push back against it. Now, if you really believe that, then go ahead and support this deal. But this is simply not going to happen. We're not going to push back, and it's not going to make pushback easier.
Actually, Omri and then David. So I'd actually.
This pushback talking point is something that plays out through a number of themes that we've discussed today. But the most obvious one is this idea that the administration consistently said whatever it had to say to get through news cycles or to get through testimony until facts on the ground made it untenable. So in September 2013, we were going to end Iran's nuclear program, force them to give up heavy water work, and roll back their ballistic missile program while forcing them to come clean. That was Secretary Sherman's explicit testimony. By 2014, some of that had changed, but but by then we were going to have a verification regime that was going to be the world's toughest and had anytime, anywhere inspections. And these progressively, as the Iranians simply said, no, we continued to give up until our goal became a one-year breakout, no Iranian coming clean, no coming clean by the Iranians. The idea that the IC has sufficient knowledge to detect an effort to break out, and so on. The fear among skeptics of this deal and critics of this deal is that the pushback argument, this administration promised to A, push back, work with our allies to push Iran back militarily, and B, double down on sanctions enforcement, will become another such promise, which is to say it'll take its place alongside the shuttering of Fordo, the resolution of PMDs, the dismantlement of centrifuges, as a promise the administration made to get Congress to back off for long enough to create new facts on the ground. And the concern is that we're already seeing that. So at the same time that the administration is saying that it intends to double down on sanctions enforcement, we see IRGC, Quds Force leaders, Qasem Soleimani specifically, who are under travel bans, traveling to Russia. And the Fox News got a scoop. They disclosed literally the flight number and the flight times of the plane that Qasem Soleimani had taken to Moscow in violation of the international travel ban on him. And the administration, when asked for several days, said, we just don't know. It was a caricature of looking the other way. As they were on the Hill, without hyperbole, literally, as they were on the Hill, saying we will double down on sanctions enforcement in order to provide what Mike described, the emotional buttressing to those who are concerned about Iranian expansionism. And after this, there's nothing left, right? The reason why they've had to make these commitments to Congress, the latest being the pushback and double down argument, is because Congress has been in a position to jam up what is a bad deal, what if lawmakers believe that the deal is bad, and of course bipartisan majorities in both chambers do believe it's bad. Once that's over, there won't be another commitment of this sort because the administration won't have to do it. And the fear is that, yet again, there will be no accountability when instead of pushing back, we end up, for instance, ceding Syria to Iranian and Russian coordination.
David?
Yeah, I can't speak to those issues.
Okay.
I would just caution, though, that there's a lot of positive things in this agreement. And sure, the duration is not one of them. I mean, based on my experience in Europe, our allies were not particularly happy with that. That at 10 years compared to what was sought of more in the 20 to 30-year range, that was the original goal, is just not enough. But it's not an easy negotiation. It's an agreement that's very long, has lots of moving parts, and decisions were made in the negotiation, and it wasn't made, I don't think it was made by Obama. I think it was made by competent negotiators that they would try to win on this or insist on winning on that, they would give on that. And so I think it's an imperfect deal, but it is the deal, and it's going to have to be implemented. And I would argue that there's a need to try to fix these weaknesses rather than draw party lines and continue this battle indefinitely. And I think Israel will be shooting itself in the foot if it doesn't start contributing very actively to trying to strengthen this deal. And I think it can be done. I think there's support around the world. I mean, on the I don't know how many of you have read about the procurement channel. I mean, it's a key part of this agreement, both on the verification side and then trying to enforce bans on Iran getting arms and missile imports. It still has to be created. The meetings, there'll be important meetings alongside this General Assembly among the
Interesting. So
stakeholders.
you think that's one place where
I think there's many. I think there's
allies could,
yeah. I think
very
there's many places. The IAEA thing is very important. There was never an intention to get the Iran to confess. I mean, it should, but it doesn't seem that it. And my understanding from negotiators, it's not a question of the supreme leader. You know, oh my God, I said we never have nuclear weapons. It's really a question of who gets blamed for sanctions. The Iranian narrative blames the West for all the suffering they've gone through on sanctions. If they said, yeah, we did have a nuclear weapons program, guess what the Iranian domestic audience is going to conclude? No, it was our fault, or more likely, the regime's fault. And so that issue cannot be settled until there's some resolution on the sanctions. So
I'm sorry, what issue cannot be?
that Iran would come clean. It can't admit politically, and it has nothing to do with the fatwa. It has everything to do with who gets blamed for sanctions in Iran and in the NAM. So I think the idea of the IA effort is not to get Iran to come clean. It's to say, we think this is what's happened, and that it did this and that. It didn't get there, and it did get, accomplish that goal. To know the people, to know the sites, and then to make a determination. And the determination may just be Iran had a nuclear weapons program. I mean, that may be all that takes place. And if they have access, have had access, so their credibility isn't undermined, that may be I would argue, the sufficient outcome of this whole issue. So again, I think that it's very important to try to find ways to strengthen this deal and to get beyond some of this fight and not make it what I fear is going to be a guerrilla warfare, particularly in the House, to undermine the deal. And I went through the agreed framework in the 90s. We were a reluctant supporter. We actually didn't stay neutral. We supported the deal despite the IA being thrown under the bus. And same arguments. Oh, there'll be war. You can't let the IA do their job. It'll cause Seoul to be incinerated. So they made a deal. We reluctantly went along, but the Congress didn't. And so every time you needed money, it was a nightmare. And here you can envision, Lindsey Graham has already said it, we may hold up money for the IA. It's again shooting yourself in the head, but if you're just trying to kill the deal, it's not a crazy strategy. And so I think real efforts have to be made to try to shift the debate to one of how do you strengthen this, even though many don't like it. And I would argue that many of the the discussions in Europe are very different. I mean, it's really different. I mean, there's not you don't have this Congress to deal with, but there's much more willingness to look at the pluses and minuses and move on. And no one is sitting there saying this is some perfect deal. Not anyone I've talked to.
Mike, did you want to?
They may say that here. I mean, what they say here, I heard, is very different than what they may say there. So let me put that on there, out there.
Michael?
In the spirit of bipartisan compromise, I'll just say that I'm in favor of giving the IAEA the money it needs to do its job.
You're willing to stake that out?
I'll go out on that limb.
Okay. Did you have anything else you wanted to do in it? Okay, so I think we do have time. We started a little late. So let's take one or two questions. Let's see, the gentleman all the way in the back. If you can wait, I think we have a microphone circulating. So if you can just wait one moment. Yes, there we go.
My name is Adam Yeff, and I'm a master's student at George Washington University. Mr. Casper, you were discussing the kind of if-then statement for congressional Republicans and the trust between Congress and the administration and the trust between them. But hasn't the Congress repeatedly tried to undermine the deal throughout the process and not given all the breathing room that was possible? And hasn't that affected the administration's trust of Congress? And the two-way relationship has become more difficult through both sides. I'd like to know your kind of going forward how Congress in general can strengthen the deal, what your opinions would be, since it seems to be going forward. Thank you.
Sure.
Omri, you want to?
Yeah,
Okay.
sure. The theory that this started off as a relationship of trust and then descended into distrust is a difficult one to sustain, if only because we know now, and in fact recordings of these meetings have leaked and been posted online, that as early as January 2014, in the case of this particular meeting, Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes was taking meetings with validators, with NGOs, to discuss how to ice Congress out of the process. Specifically, the phrase I think from that meeting was to create a structure that would circumvent Congress. Whether or not that was justified, whether or not, Secretary Kerry has said the reason they didn't pursue a treaty is because they knew they couldn't get 2/3, which is a fairly strange admission to make in those terms, but nonetheless, it's one that they made. I think that at various times Congress was less cooperative, at various times more cooperative, but there has been an enormous appetite in Congress for the last 2 years to pass non-nuclear sanctions, which are explicitly permitted under both the JPOA and the JCPOA, and they were told in as many words, well, I can't use that word on camera, they were told, please don't mess this up for us. Of course you're allowed to do it, but please don't. And Congress didn't. And Republican Congresses and Democratic Congresses, Republican Houses and Democratic Houses, Senates, did not. And so I think that Congress has provided an enormous amount of breathing room over the better instincts of many of its members. And for instance, I believe it was Senator Booker, but one of the Democratic senators who recently came out in support of the JCPOA, or technically against a resolution of disapproval, said, if I could go back, I think we potentially made a mistake by not pursuing new sanctions legislation. He was specifically, I think, referencing the spring push on Kirk Menendez. Moving forward, Congress will take two tracks. There will be efforts to kill the deal. There will be efforts to strengthen the deal. But one of the things you're going to see is an effort to work with the administration to make good on the administration's pledge to double down on non-nuclear sanctions. And if it does turn out that the pledge for non-nuclear sanctions was another one of these commitments that were made just to get out of the news cycle, then I think you'll see irreparable harm to the inter-branch relations.
Did you want to say anything, or are you? Okay. Let's take one more. This gentleman right here on my left.
Thank you very much. Scott Edelman, recently retired State Department officer. In the last week or so, one of the new aspects of SPIN has been that the agreement allows for some limited continuing research on uranium and its properties, but that it stops any research on plutonium, and that if you really want a bomb, what you really want is plutonium. I wonder if you could comment on that bit of SPIN.
Yeah, there was a New York Times piece about the Iraq reactor. I think Broad, I like Broad and respect his work. I mean, they left out a key thing, which is the reprocessing or the plutonium separation. And so the Iraq reactor's always been secondary to enrichment. And part of the main reason is that it wasn't done. It's turned out it wasn't close to being operational. They had and that Iran had said that it didn't intend to build a plant to separate the plutonium produced in the reactor. And so it wasn't equivalent. I mean, Natanz Fordow gives Iran the ability to make weapon-grade uranium that could then be used in a bomb. Iraq when finished, would get Iran the ability to have plutonium and spent fuel. It has lots of plutonium and spent Bouchier reactor fuel, too. And so they needed a reprocessing plant. And yes, we think Iran was working on that years ago, but it stopped. And so it's really, the enriched uranium part has always gotten the priority. And the administration pursued that, as you probably know, much harder than the Iraq reactor part. Everyone's happy with the limitations on the Iraq reactor, for sure. But the story, I think, oversimplified and even kind of misrepresented what was happening. But I do want to point out that in this deal, Iran has committed not to do research on uranium and plutonium metallurgy. I don't know anyone who's made a bomb using uranium oxide, HEU oxide. I mean, they use metal. And so Iran is committed not to do that research indefinitely, along with several other nuclear weaponization activities. And so that was seen as a very positive achievement in this. And I think I don't know who originated it. Certainly I know the French were big proponents of it. And so I think that's an important achievement. It's also another reason why you want Parchin to go right. That experiment is related to a development of a nuclear weapons component. It's very small scale, very hard to find, and you want the IAEA to be able to go places quickly, without challenge, in order to verify that those kind of activities aren't taking place. And in the final agreement, it's going to be these nuclear weaponization activities that are banned that the IAEA is going to have to verify, and they're very, very difficult to verify. If you can't get to the military sites, you can't verify that part of the agreement at all.
David, thank you very much. I think that is going to bring our panel to a close. I want to thank especially David Albright, Omri Ceren, Michael Doran, and I want to thank our C-SPAN audience, and most of all, I want to thank you for showing up this afternoon. Thank you very much, and see you soon.